What would you do if, one day, you found yourself standing on the sidewalk with your child, all your belongings scattered around you, and no place to call home? Would you fight back, or would you accept that some battles are too big for one person? This was the exact situation that Melissa, a hardworking single mother, faced one chilly afternoon. Melissa had been living in a modest apartment with her 6-year-old daughter, Maya, for almost 3 years. She paid her rent on time, kept the place clean, and never caused any trouble. But none of that seemed to matter to Mr. Thompson, the landlord. Without warning, he showed up one day with an eviction notice, claiming she had violated some new policy that she had never heard of before. Melissa's heart pounded as she tried to reason with him. She pleaded, explaining that she had no other place to go and that Maya needed stability. Mr. Thompson, however, wasn't interested. He stood there on his pristine porch, his face devoid of empathy, and pointed his finger toward the street, ordering her to leave. It was clear, he wanted her out, and he wasn't going to listen to her side of the story. As Melissa packed her things, holding back tears, she felt a mix of fear, anger, and helplessness. But deep down, a question burned in her mind: was this right? Could he really do this to her without any valid reason? That night, as she sat with Maya in a friend's cramped living room, Melissa decided she wouldn't just walk away quietly. She would find out if there was any justice left for people like her. The next morning, she sought help from a local community center and was introduced to a lawyer who specialized in tenants' rights. The lawyer, a calm and confident woman named Rebecca, listened to Melissa's story and nodded thoughtfully. "This doesn't sound right," Rebecca said. "And I think we can do something about it." Days turned into weeks, and with Rebecca's help, Melissa filed a case against Mr. Thompson, claiming illegal eviction and harassment. The day finally came when she would face him again, this time in court, not on the street. Mr. Thompson walked in with his usual arrogance, but as soon as he saw Rebecca and the evidence piled against him, his expression changed. He hadn't expected Melissa to fight back, much less come armed with a competent lawyer and a solid case. Would the law finally side with Melissa, or would Mr. Thompson use his wealth and influence to twist the outcome in his favor? What would happen when all the facts were laid bare in front of the judge? Stay tuned to find out how one determined mother stood up for her rights and showed that no one should be treated unfairly, regardless of their status or background. Chapter 1: The Unexpected Eviction. What would you do if, one day, you found yourself standing on the sidewalk with your child, all your belongings scattered around you, and no place to call home? Would you fight back, or would you accept that some battles are too big for one person? This was the exact situation that Melissa Jones, a hardworking single mother, faced one chilly afternoon. Melissa had been living in a modest apartment with her 6-year-old daughter, Maya, for almost 3 years. She paid her rent on time, kept the place clean, and never caused any trouble. But none of that seemed to matter to Mr. William Thompson, the landlord. Without warning, he showed up one day with an eviction notice, claiming she had violated some new policy that she had never heard of before. Melissa's heart pounded as she tried to reason with him. She pleaded, explaining that she had no other place to go and that Maya needed stability. Mr. Thompson, however, wasn't interested. He stood there on his pristine porch, his face devoid of empathy, and pointed his finger toward the street, ordering her to leave. It was clear, he wanted her out, and he wasn't going to listen to her side of the story. As Melissa packed her things, holding back tears, she felt a mix of fear, anger, and helplessness. But deep down, a question burned in her mind: was this right? Could he really do this to her without any valid reason? That night, as she sat with Maya in a friend's cramped living room, Melissa decided she wouldn't just walk away quietly. She would find out if there was any justice left for people like her. The next morning, she sought help from a local community center and was introduced to a lawyer who specialized in tenants' rights. The lawyer, a calm and confident woman named Rebecca Miller, listened to Melissa's story and nodded thoughtfully. "This doesn't sound right," Rebecca said. "And I think we can do something about it." Chapter 2: Gathering Strength. Rebecca Miller wasn't just any lawyer. She was known in the community for her tenacity and dedication to fighting for people who were often overlooked by the justice system. She had taken on cases against big corporations and city officials, and she wasn't afraid to stand up to those with power. When she heard Melissa's story, she felt a familiar fire ignite within her. They spent hours that day going over every detail of the eviction notice, the lease agreement, and Melissa's payment history. Rebecca's eyes narrowed as she reviewed the so-called new policy that Mr. Thompson claimed Melissa had violated. It was a vague clause added to the lease agreement just a month ago, hidden in the fine print and never verbally communicated to the tenants. Rebecca saw this for what it was, a deliberate attempt to push Melissa out. "You're not alone, Melissa," Rebecca reassured her. "We've got a strong case here. This is not just about your home, it's about standing up against people who think they can manipulate the system to suit themselves." Melissa felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in days, she believed there might be a way out of this nightmare. She spent the next few weeks working closely with Rebecca, gathering evidence, collecting statements from neighbors who had witnessed Mr. Thompson's behavior, and preparing for what was bound to be a tough legal battle. Chapter 3, The community rallies. News of Melissa's plight spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Many residents were furious, having faced similar issues with Mr. Thompson but never daring to challenge him. Melissa's fight became their fight, a symbol of resistance against a landlord who had been exploiting his tenants for far too long. One evening, as Melissa and Rebecca were preparing for the court case, a knock came at Rebecca's office door. It was Mrs. Lopez, an elderly neighbor from Melissa's building, along with a few other tenants. Mrs. Lopez, who had lived in the building for over 20 years, shared her story of how Mr. Thompson had tried to force her out when her husband passed away, hoping to raise the rent for new tenants. "I didn't know what to do back then," Mrs. Lopez said, her voice trembling. "But if you're standing up to him now, then I want to stand with you." This show of solidarity warmed Melissa's heart. For the first time since the eviction notice, she didn't feel quite so alone. The community came together, organizing fundraisers, supporting Melissa emotionally and financially, and showing up for her and Maya whenever they needed help. Maya, despite her young age, could sense the shift too. She wasn't just scared anymore, she was proud of her mother and the fight she was putting up. Chapter 4, The day in court. The day of the court hearing arrived. Melissa walked into the courtroom, her heart pounding, but her head held high. She wore a simple but elegant dress that Rebecca had helped her pick out, and her hair was neatly braided. Maya, sitting with a family friend in the audience, waved at her with a smile. Mr. Thompson arrived shortly after, flanked by his high-priced lawyer. He had a smug expression on his face, as if he was just there to watch a formality play out. But as soon as Rebecca began presenting their case, his demeanor started to change. Rebecca was sharp and relentless, pointing out the dubious nature of the new policy, and how it clearly targeted Melissa unfairly. "Mr. Thompson," Rebecca said, turning to him during cross-examination, "can you explain why this new policy was never communicated directly to the tenants, nor included in any official lease updates?" Thompson stuttered, caught off guard. His lawyer tried to object, but the judge allowed Rebecca to continue. As she laid out the facts, it became clear that this wasn't just an issue of an unfair eviction but a pattern of harassment and manipulation. Mr. Thompson's lawyer tried to shift the blame onto Melissa, suggesting she had violated other terms of the lease, but Rebecca was ready. She calmly presented evidence showing that Melissa had been an exemplary tenant. She also brought forward the testimonies of neighbors like Mrs. Lopez, who attested to Mr. Thompson's shady tactics. By the end of the hearing, Mr. Thompson looked visibly shaken. His arrogance had vanished, replaced by a nervous sweat. The judge, after reviewing all the evidence, made a surprising move. "I find the evidence compelling and sufficient to rule in favor of the plaintiff, Ms. Melissa Jones," the judge declared. "Furthermore, I am recommending a full investigation into Mr. Thompson's business practices regarding his properties." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Melissa couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had won. She turned to Rebecca, who gave her a knowing smile. It wasn't just a victory for Melissa but for everyone who had been bullied by people like Mr. Thompson. Chapter 5, The aftermath. In the weeks following the court decision, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. There was a renewed sense of hope and unity. Mr. Thompson, on the other hand, found himself under scrutiny not only from the city housing authority but also from the media. Several other tenants came forward with similar stories, and soon, his name became synonymous with exploitation and greed. Melissa's victory became a catalyst for broader change. She was approached by local housing rights organizations and asked to speak about her experience, empowering other tenants to know their rights and stand up for themselves. She became an unexpected but powerful voice in the community, advocating for fair housing policies and tenant protections. Meanwhile, her relationship with Maya grew stronger than ever. Maya, who had always admired her mother, now saw her as a true hero. "Mommy, you're so brave," she would say, hugging her tightly. And Melissa, holding her daughter close, would smile and whisper, "We're brave, together." Rebecca continued to work closely with Melissa, and they became good friends. Their journey wasn't just about a single eviction case but about the power of community, resilience, and the importance of standing up for what is right. Chapter 6. A new beginning. Months passed, and Melissa's life began to stabilize. She found a new apartment in a nearby neighborhood, one that was just as warm and welcoming but without the looming threat of a landlord like Mr. Thompson. Her story had inspired others to fight back against injustice, and she had become a symbol of strength and perseverance. On a sunny afternoon, as Melissa and Maya were unpacking boxes in their new home, they received a surprise visit. It was Rebecca, carrying a small plant as a housewarming gift. "I thought this might brighten up your new place," she said with a grin. Melissa smiled, grateful for the friendship and support she had found in Rebecca. "Thank you for everything," she said. "I couldn't have done this without you." Rebecca shook her head. "You did this, Melissa. You found your voice and used it when it mattered the most. That's something no one can take away from you." As they sat down for a cup of tea, Melissa reflected on how far she had come. She had faced fear, uncertainty, and injustice, but she had also discovered a strength within herself that she never knew she had. Her fight was far from over. She knew there were many more battles to be fought, but now she was ready. And so, as the sun set on their new beginning, Melissa and Maya looked out from their small but cozy balcony, feeling a sense of peace and hope. They had faced the storm and come out stronger on the other side. Their story wasn't just about eviction, courtrooms, or landlords. It was about the power of standing up for oneself, the importance of community, and the enduring strength of a mother's love. Melissa knew that no matter what came next, she and Maya would face it together, brave, united, and unyielding. Chapter 7. The power of persistence. With her newfound reputation as a voice for tenants' rights, Melissa found herself increasingly involved in community activism. Her victory against Mr. Thompson had not only given her confidence but had also opened doors to opportunities she had never imagined. Local community centers invited her to speak at events, and her story was shared widely on social media, drawing attention to the challenges faced by low-income families in dealing with unethical landlords. Melissa decided to channel this momentum into something meaningful. She enrolled in evening classes to study social work, driven by a desire to help others who were in situations similar to hers. It wasn't easy juggling her job, school, and caring for Maya, but she was determined to make it work. Maya, ever the observant child, seemed to understand why her mother was pushing herself so hard. "You're helping people like us, right, Mommy?" she asked one night as Melissa tucked her into bed. Melissa nodded, her eyes softening. "Yes, sweetie. I want to make sure no one has to go through what we did." But even as she pushed forward, she knew that change wouldn't come without a fight. Mr. Thompson and his ilk weren't the only ones using their wealth and influence to manipulate the system. There were countless others like him, and the only way to combat them was through awareness, education, and relentless advocacy. Chapter 8. A new adversary. While Melissa was making strides in her community work, she caught the attention of other powerful landlords in the city, who began to view her as a threat. One such person was Margaret Whitfield, a prominent real estate mogul known for her aggressive business tactics. Unlike Thompson, who had inherited his properties, Margaret had built her empire from the ground up, and she wasn't about to let anyone tarnish her reputation or interfere with her business. Margaret had heard about Melissa's victory and was concerned about the potential ripple effects. If more tenants started fighting back, her profits could suffer. Determined to prevent that from happening, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She began by quietly supporting a campaign against Melissa, funding a group of lawyers and PR professionals to discredit her and frame her as a troublemaker. One evening, after finishing her classes, Melissa found herself ambushed by a local reporter as she left the community center. "Ms. Jones, how do you respond to allegations that you're encouraging tenants to break their leases and cause disruptions?" the reporter asked, thrusting a microphone in her face. Melissa was caught off guard. "That's not true," she replied, trying to remain composed. "I'm advocating for tenants to know their rights and to stand up against unfair treatment. There's a big difference." The reporter continued to press her with more pointed questions, clearly trying to corner her. Melissa managed to fend them off, but she knew that this was just the beginning. She suspected that someone powerful was trying to undermine her efforts, and she needed to be prepared. Chapter 9. Building a coalition. Realizing she couldn't fight this battle alone, Melissa reached out to Rebecca for advice. "I think we're up against someone with deep pockets," she said during a meeting at Rebecca's office. "We need to build a coalition, bring more people into the fight." Rebecca nodded. "You're right. The more voices we have, the harder it will be for them to silence us. I know a few people who might be willing to join forces." Together, they began reaching out to other community leaders, tenant advocacy groups, and legal aid organizations. They held meetings, organized workshops, and launched a citywide campaign to educate tenants about their rights. Melissa's story was at the forefront of the movement, but it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the many people who were suffering in silence, afraid to speak out. The coalition quickly gained momentum, drawing attention from local politicians who were looking to align themselves with the cause. Councilwoman Sandra Lee, a progressive leader with a strong following, publicly endorsed their efforts and vowed to introduce new legislation to protect renters from predatory landlords. This was a major victory, but Melissa knew that with every step forward, the pushback from people like Margaret Whitfield would only intensify. Chapter 10. The counterattack. Margaret Whitfield wasn't one to back down. She watched as the coalition grew stronger, and with each passing day, her frustration turned to anger. She decided to take a more direct approach. Using her connections, she arranged a private meeting with several city officials and began lobbying against the proposed legislation. She argued that the new laws would hurt business, drive investors away, and ultimately lead to a decline in the city's economy. She also funded a smear campaign against Councilwoman Sandra Lee, digging up old controversies and spreading misinformation to weaken her public support. The media began to pick up on these stories, and soon, the coalition found itself on the defensive. But Margaret didn't stop there. She targeted Melissa directly, hiring private investigators to dig into her past, hoping to find something, anything, that could be used against her. They combed through her history, interviewing former colleagues, neighbors, and even distant relatives. One evening, Melissa received a call from a former employer who told her that someone had been asking about her employment record. She realized that things were about to get ugly. Chapter 11. Standing firm despite the mounting pressure, Melissa refused to back down. She knew that this fight wasn't just about her anymore, it was about all the people depending on her to make a difference. She continued to attend rallies, give interviews, and speak out whenever she could. Her persistence inspired others, and soon, more tenants who had been wronged by landlords like Margaret came forward with their stories. Rebecca, too, was undeterred. She filed several lawsuits against Margaret's properties, citing numerous violations that had been uncovered during their investigation. The legal battles were fierce, and Margaret's lawyers were some of the best money could buy, but Rebecca was relentless. At one particularly heated court hearing, Margaret finally made an appearance. She was a tall, imposing woman in her early 50s, with sharp features and a commanding presence. She looked at Melissa and Rebecca with a mixture of disdain and curiosity, as if trying to size up her opponents. But when Rebecca presented a damning piece of evidence, a recorded conversation between one of Margaret's property managers and a tenant discussing illegal evictions, Margaret's expression shifted. She realized that she might have underestimated them. Chapter 12. A turning point. The pressure continued to mount, and the public was beginning to see through the smear campaign against Councilwoman Lee and Melissa. The coalition's message was clear and resonated with people across the city. It was time to stand up against corruption and exploitation. One day, while Melissa was attending a community meeting, she received an unexpected visitor, Margaret Whitfield herself. The room fell silent as Margaret walked in, her eyes scanning the faces around her. She was clearly out of her element, but she had come for a reason. "I want to talk," Margaret said, addressing Melissa directly. "In private." Melissa was taken aback, but she agreed. They stepped outside into the cool evening air, and Margaret wasted no time getting to the point. "I'm not here to apologize," she said bluntly. "I've built my business from the ground up, and I've done what I've had to do to survive in this industry. But I can see that this isn't going away." Melissa listened, her expression unreadable. "What do you want, Margaret?" Margaret sighed. "I want a deal. I'm willing to make some changes, implement some reforms in how my properties are managed. In exchange, you and your coalition back off on the lawsuits and stop pushing for this new legislation." Melissa shook her head. "This isn't about making deals. This is about justice and fairness. You can't buy your way out of this." Margaret's face hardened. "You think you're so righteous, but you don't understand what it takes to run a business in this city. If you're not willing to play ball, you're going to find out the hard way." Melissa stood her ground. If that's a threat, I'm not scared. We're not going anywhere, and neither is this fight. Margaret left without another word, but Melissa knew this wouldn't be the end of it. She had made a powerful enemy, but she also knew she was on the right side of history. Chapter 13, a hard-fought victory. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The coalition continued to push for legislative changes, and the lawsuits against Margaret's properties moved forward. Public support was growing, and even some of Margaret's allies began to distance themselves from her as more stories of tenant abuse came to light. Finally, after months of legal battles, political maneuvering, and public advocacy, the city council voted on the new tenant protection legislation. It was a narrow vote, but in the end, it passed. The new laws provided stronger safeguards for renters, making it harder for landlords to engage in unethical practices without facing significant consequences. Margaret, realizing that her reputation and business were at stake, decided to settle the lawsuits. She agreed to pay a substantial sum in fines and compensation to affected tenants and committed to changing the way her properties were managed. It was a hard pill for her to swallow, but she knew it was the only way to salvage what was left of her empire. For Melissa, it was a moment of triumph. She had started this fight to protect her home and her daughter, but it had turned into something much bigger, a movement that would help countless others. Chapter 14, looking ahead. With the legislative victory behind her, Melissa continued her work in the community. She completed her studies in social work and began working full-time at a nonprofit organization dedicated to housing justice. Her experience, resilience, and authenticity made her a natural leader, and she was soon running workshops, leading campaigns, and mentoring others. Maya, now growing up with a deeper understanding of fairness and justice, often accompanied her mother to events and meetings. She had seen firsthand the power of standing up for what's right and had become an advocate in her own right, even at her young age. One evening, after a long day of work in community organizing, Melissa and Maya sat together on the balcony of their new home. The city skyline was lit up in the distance, a symbol of all the challenges and victories they had faced together. What's next, Mommy? Maya asked, her eyes full of curiosity. Melissa smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. I don't know, sweetie. But whatever it is, I know we'll face it together. And so, as the city buzzed with life below them, Melissa and Maya looked to the future, knowing that they had the strength, courage, and community to take on whatever came their way. Chapter 15, New Horizons. Melissa's work in housing justice continued to grow in impact. She became a well-known figure in the city, not just for her legal victory but for her relentless advocacy for fair housing. Her story was featured in local and national news, inspiring people far beyond her community. She was invited to speak at conferences, and her journey was even highlighted in a documentary about tenant rights and urban justice. While Melissa appreciated the recognition, her primary focus remained on the ground, working directly with those who needed support the most. She knew there were still countless families facing unfair evictions, poor living conditions, and unscrupulous landlords. She wanted to ensure that the momentum they had built didn't fizzle out now that they had won a few battles. One day, after a successful town hall meeting, Melissa received a call from a woman named Dr. Helen Rogers, the director of a prominent social justice think tank. Dr. Rogers had been following Melissa's work closely and wanted to collaborate on a new initiative, a nationwide campaign to push for comprehensive housing reform at the federal level. Melissa, you've done incredible work locally, Dr. Rogers said. But we need voices like yours on a larger stage. This campaign could change the lives of millions of people across the country. The idea was daunting. Melissa had always focused on her immediate community, but she realized that the issues they were facing weren't unique to their city. She discussed it with Rebecca, who was now not just her lawyer but one of her closest friends and allies. Go for it, Melissa, Rebecca encouraged. You've already proven you can make a difference here. Why not take it to the next level? After some consideration, Melissa decided to join the initiative. She began traveling to different cities, meeting with local tenant organizations, and helping to organize rallies and workshops. Her passion and authenticity resonated with people everywhere she went. Chapter 16, The Cost of Advocacy. However, with New Horizons came new challenges. Traveling frequently meant spending less time with Maya, who was now 8 years old. Melissa did her best to balance her work with her responsibilities as a mother, but it wasn't easy. Maya was proud of her mom, but she missed the time they used to spend together. She didn't fully understand why her mother had to be away so often, and sometimes it showed. One evening, as Melissa was preparing for a trip to Washington, D.C., Maya sat quietly at the dinner table, poking at her food. "Are you leaving again, Mommy?" she asked, her voice small and hesitant. Melissa's heart sank. She knew this was hard on Maya. "Yes, sweetheart, just for a few days. I promise I'll be back before you know it." "But you always say that," Maya replied, her eyes filling with tears. "I miss you when you're gone." Melissa knelt down beside her, hugging her tightly. "I know, Maya. I miss you too, more than you know. But I'm doing this so that other mommies and daddies don't have to worry about losing their homes. I'm doing it for us, for our future." Maya nodded, wiping her eyes. "I understand, Mommy. I just want you to be here more." Melissa knew she had to find a better balance. She started taking Maya with her whenever she could, turning her advocacy trips into educational experiences for her daughter. Together, they visited different communities, learning about the unique struggles each one faced. It became a bonding experience, allowing Maya to see the world through her mother's eyes. Chapter 17, A New Friendship. During one of these trips, they visited a small town in Ohio where a local tenant rights organization was struggling to gain traction. The town was dominated by a single real estate company that controlled most of the rental properties. The residents were wary of speaking out, fearing retaliation from the powerful landlords. At a community meeting, Melissa met a young woman named Sarah who was organizing tenants in her building. Sarah was passionate but inexperienced, and she had been facing significant pushback from the landlords. Melissa saw a lot of herself in Sarah, determined, but needing guidance. After the meeting, Sarah approached Melissa. "I've read about your story, and I'm so inspired by what you've done," she said. "But I don't know if we can win here. People are scared, and they don't trust that anything will change." Melissa smiled. "I've been where you are, Sarah. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it's never easy. But it starts with people like you, people who aren't afraid to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.'" Over the next few days, Melissa worked closely with Sarah, helping her develop a strategy to build trust within her community and take the fight to the local city council. They organized a protest outside the council chambers, demanding better protections for renters and an end to predatory practices by landlords. Maya, watching her mother and Sarah work together, began to understand why her mom was so committed to this cause. She saw how her mother's presence empowered others, how her words could turn fear into courage. By the end of their visit, the local council had agreed to meet with the tenants and hear their concerns, a small victory, but a significant one for the residents who had felt powerless for so long. Sarah hugged Melissa tightly. "Thank you for believing in us," she said. "You've shown us that we can make a difference." Chapter 18, The National Stage. Back in Washington, D.C., the campaign for comprehensive housing reform was heating up. Dr. Rogers had organized a summit bringing together housing advocates, policymakers, and affected tenants from across the country. Melissa was one of the keynote speakers, and she knew this was her chance to make a real impact. As she stood on stage in front of hundreds of people, Melissa felt a mix of nerves and excitement. She took a deep breath and began to speak, sharing her story and the stories of the people she had met along the way, people like Sarah, Mrs. Lopez, and countless others who had faced injustice and refused to back down. "We're here today because we believe in fairness, in justice, and in the right of every person to have a safe and secure place to call home," Melissa said, her voice strong and clear. "We've seen what happens when people come together and stand up for what's right. We've seen change, and we've seen hope. But our work isn't done. Not until every tenant, in every city and town across this country, can live without fear of losing their home." The room erupted in applause. Maya, sitting in the front row, beamed with pride. She saw her mother not just as her mom but as a true leader, someone who was changing the world one step at a time. Chapter 19, The Struggle continues. While the summit was a success and brought national attention to the cause, the fight for housing justice was far from over. Powerful real estate interests and their lobbyists continued to resist any changes that threatened their profits. They launched counter-campaigns, funding political candidates who opposed housing reform and using their influence to sway public opinion. Melissa and her coalition knew they were in for a long battle. They worked tirelessly to counter these efforts, organizing grassroots campaigns, holding town halls, and keeping the pressure on lawmakers to stand by their commitments. One day, as Melissa was preparing for another round of meetings on Capitol Hill, she received a phone call from an unexpected source. Margaret Whitfield. I think we need to talk, Margaret said, her tone surprisingly neutral. There are things happening behind the scenes that you need to know about. Melissa was wary but agreed to meet. They sat down in a small cafe near the Capitol, a far cry from their previous confrontational encounters. I'm not here to make amends, Margaret began. But I've been in this business long enough to know when things are shifting. There's a new wave of investors coming in, and they don't care about the rules. They're more ruthless than I ever was. If you think you've faced resistance so far, you haven't seen anything yet. Melissa listened carefully. She knew Margaret wasn't an ally, but she also wasn't lying. The stakes were higher than ever. What are you suggesting? Melissa asked cautiously. I'm suggesting we find common ground, Margaret replied. You want protections for tenants, and I want to protect my investments from these new players. There might be a way we can both get what we want. Melissa didn't trust Margaret, but she understood the reality of political alliances. Sometimes, progress required working with those who weren't always on your side. Chapter 20, An Unlikely Alliance. Melissa and Margaret began a tenuous partnership, focusing on areas where their interests aligned. They started lobbying for regulations that would prevent outside investors from buying up properties and evicting tenants en masse. It was a delicate balance, but it provided Melissa's coalition with more leverage and opened up new avenues for dialogue with lawmakers who had been on the fence. Despite their differences, Melissa found herself learning from Margaret. She was cunning and strategic, and while her motivations were self-serving, her insights into the industry were invaluable. Margaret, in turn, begrudgingly respected Melissa's commitment and her ability to galvanize public support. The collaboration was not without its tensions. At one heated meeting, Rebecca, who had been skeptical of the alliance from the start, confronted Melissa privately. Are you sure about this? We fought so hard against people like her. Melissa sighed. I know, Rebecca. But this isn't about liking each other. It's about winning the bigger fight. And right now, we need every advantage we can get. Rebecca nodded, still uneasy but trusting Melissa's judgment. Just don't forget why we started this. Chapter 21, The Turning Point. The alliance began to pay off. With new regulations proposed, the tide started to turn in favor of the tenants. Public opinion was shifting, and lawmakers began to see the need for more robust protections, but the real breakthrough came when Melissa's coalition, backed by some unexpected allies, successfully pushed through a bill that provided significant funding for affordable housing and tenant protections nationwide. It was a historic victory and a testament to the power of persistence and unity. Margaret, having secured her interests, withdrew from the partnership but not without a parting remark. You got what you wanted, Melissa. Just remember, the game doesn't end here. There will always be another battle. Melissa nodded, knowing that Margaret was right. The struggle for justice was never ending, but that didn't mean it wasn't worth fighting for. Chapter 22, Building a Legacy. Years passed, and the landscape of housing justice continued to evolve. Melissa's coalition became a national organization, with chapters in multiple states and a network of dedicated activists. Rebecca, now a renowned civil rights attorney, continued to work closely with Melissa, tackling new challenges and cases that came their way. Maya, now a teenager, had grown into a passionate young activist herself. She often spoke at events, sharing her perspective as someone who had lived through the struggles and victories alongside her mother. She was determined to carry on the work that Melissa had started, adding her voice to the fight for a fairer and more just world. One day, as Melissa and Maya walked through a newly built affordable housing complex that their organization had helped fund, Maya turned to her mother. Do you think it's enough, Mom? All that we've done? Melissa smiled, a mixture of pride and reflection in her eyes. It's never enough, Maya. There will always be more to do, more people to help, more battles to fight. But what matters is that we're trying, that we're making things better, step by step. Maya nodded, understanding the weight of her mother's words. She knew that this was her legacy to carry forward, a legacy of courage, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to justice. As they stood there, looking at the families moving into their new homes, Melissa felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had fought hard, faced down powerful enemies, and, against all odds, made a real difference. And while the future would bring new challenges, she knew one thing for sure: as long as there were people willing to stand up and fight for what was right, there would always be hope. Chapter 23, The Road to Change. Melissa and Maya's visit to the new housing complex marked a significant milestone in their journey, but it was far from the end. With the growth of her organization, Melissa found herself juggling even more responsibilities. The organization was expanding rapidly, with chapters in major cities advocating for stronger tenant protections, affordable housing, and fair landlord practices. However, with growth came growing pains. There were disagreements within the coalition about priorities and strategies. Some members wanted to focus more on direct action, protests and demonstrations, while others argued for a more legislative approach, lobbying for policy changes at the state and federal levels. Melissa found herself in the middle of these debates, trying to keep the coalition united while ensuring they remained effective. One evening, after a particularly intense meeting, Melissa sat down with Rebecca to discuss the path forward. "We're making progress, but it feels like we're constantly fighting on all fronts," Melissa said, her exhaustion evident in her voice. "We need a clear direction, a strategy that can unify everyone." Rebecca nodded. "I agree. But remember, Melissa, this movement is bigger than any one person. We need to listen to what our members are saying and find a balance. We've always known that this fight would be complex." As they brainstormed, a new idea began to take shape: a national tenants convention, bringing together tenant rights organizations, housing advocates, and community leaders from across the country. The convention would be a chance to share strategies, build solidarity, and set a cohesive agenda for the future of the movement. Chapter 24, A Gathering of Voices. The idea of a national convention quickly gained traction. Over the next few months, Melissa and her team worked tirelessly to organize the event, reaching out to allies, securing funding, and coordinating logistics. The convention would take place in New York City, a symbolic choice given the city's long history of housing struggles and activism. As the date approached, excitement and tension filled the air. It was clear that the convention would be a turning point for the movement, an opportunity to rally around a unified vision but also a potential flashpoint for existing disagreements. When the day finally arrived, the convention hall was packed with thousands of attendees. There were people from all walks of life: young activists, seasoned organizers, lawyers, policy experts, and everyday tenants who had traveled from across the country to have their voices heard. Melissa took the stage to deliver the opening address. She looked out at the crowd, filled with anticipation, and felt a surge of emotion. "We're here today because we believe in the power of community, the power of solidarity, and the power of justice," she began. "We've come from different places, different backgrounds, but we share a common goal: a future where everyone has a safe, affordable place to call home." The audience erupted in applause, and Melissa continued. She spoke about the victories they had achieved, the challenges that remained, and the need to work together, despite their differences, to build a stronger and more equitable movement. The convention featured workshops, panel discussions, and strategy sessions. There were heated debates, but there was also a sense of shared purpose. People were inspired by Melissa's story and the stories of others who had fought against the odds to secure justice. One of the most powerful moments came when a young mother from Detroit took the stage to share her story. She had been evicted from her home in the dead of winter and had lived in her car with her 2 children for months before finding help from a local tenant rights group. Her story was a stark reminder of why they were all there. "Change doesn't happen in a day, a week, or a month," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It happens when we refuse to give up, when we keep pushing, keep fighting, and keep believing that a better world is possible." Chapter 25, The Shadow of Adversity. The convention was a success, but it also drew the attention of powerful opponents. As the tenant movement gained momentum, real estate developers, corporate landlords, and their political allies began to push back harder. They saw the growing coalition as a direct threat to their interests and profits. A well-funded campaign was launched to discredit Melissa and her organization. They hired public relations firms to create ads portraying tenant activists as radical extremists who wanted to destroy private property rights. The ads aired on television, ran in newspapers, and spread across social media, sowing fear and division. One particularly vicious ad featured a doctored video of Melissa, taken out of context, to make it appear as though she was calling for violence against landlords. The smear campaign was designed to tarnish her reputation and erode public support for the movement. Melissa was furious when she saw the ad. "This is a lie, and they know it," she told Rebecca, her hands shaking with anger. "They're trying to turn people against us by spreading fear and misinformation." Rebecca nodded. "We knew this would happen. The more we grow, the harder they'll fight to stop us. But we can't let them control the narrative. We need to fight back with the truth." The coalition quickly organized a media response, holding press conferences and releasing statements to debunk the false claims. They leveraged social media to share real stories from tenants who had been harmed by unfair practices, countering the negative ads with powerful, personal testimonies. However, the attacks took a toll on Melissa. She found herself facing criticism from all sides, some from within the movement who believed she wasn't doing enough to combat the smear campaign, and others who thought she was becoming too much of a public figure and overshadowing the grassroots nature of the cause. Chapter 26. A test of leadership. The internal tensions within the coalition reached a boiling point when a faction of activists called for a vote of no confidence in Melissa's leadership. They argued that the movement needed new voices and new strategies to address the growing opposition. Melissa was hurt but understood their frustrations. She called for a meeting with the coalition's core members to discuss the future of the organization. Standing in front of the group, she spoke with humility and honesty. "I've never claimed to have all the answers, and I know I've made mistakes," she said. "But I believe in this movement and what we're fighting for. If you think it's time for new leadership, I'll step aside. This isn't about me, it's about all of us." There was a long silence, and then Sarah, the young organizer from Ohio, stood up. "Melissa, you've inspired so many of us to take action. You've been our leader, but more importantly, you've been our friend. I think we need you now more than ever." Others echoed Sarah's sentiments, and the vote of no confidence was narrowly defeated. Melissa remained at the helm, but she knew that things had to change. She worked to decentralize leadership, empowering regional leaders and encouraging more diverse voices to take the lead on key initiatives. Chapter 27. The Long March. With renewed energy and a more collaborative structure, the coalition continued to press forward. They organized a series of coordinated actions across multiple cities, a long march for housing justice that would culminate in a massive rally in Washington, D.C. Melissa and Maya, now a teenager and a seasoned activist in her own right, walked side by side at the front of the march. They were joined by thousands of people, families, students, workers, and elders, marching together for a cause that touched all their lives. The march was grueling, with long days of walking in the heat and cold, but it was also a powerful demonstration of solidarity. Along the way, they held rallies, gave speeches, and built relationships with communities across the country. They saw firsthand the diversity of the struggle for housing justice and the different ways it manifested in urban, suburban, and rural settings. Maya, inspired by the people they met and the stories they heard, decided to take a more active role in organizing the youth. She started a youth caucus within the coalition, focusing on engaging young people and amplifying their voices. Chapter 28. A new generation takes the lead. The youth caucus quickly became one of the most dynamic parts of the movement. Under Maya's leadership, they organized creative actions, from flash mobs to digital campaigns, to raise awareness and bring new energy to the cause. Maya's passion and commitment were evident, and she soon became a respected voice in her own right. She was invited to speak at the final rally in Washington, D.C., alongside her mother and other leaders. As she took the stage, Maya looked out at the sea of people, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. She thought of all the people who had come before her, who had paved the way for her to stand there. "We are the next generation," she began, her voice steady and strong. "We've inherited a world with many problems, but we've also inherited a legacy of resistance and resilience. We are here to say that we will not back down. We will not be silent. And we will not stop until everyone has a place to call home." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Melissa watched with pride as her daughter took the mantle of leadership. She knew that Maya, and the countless other young people in the movement, would carry the fight forward long after she was gone. Chapter 29. The battle never ends. The rally in Washington was a defining moment, but Melissa knew the work was far from over. The movement had achieved significant victories, but there were still many battles to be fought. As the coalition continued to grow and evolve, Melissa began to step back from day-to-day leadership. She wanted to focus on mentorship, helping to guide the next generation of leaders and ensure that the movement remained strong and united. Rebecca, too, began to look toward the future. She had spent years in the trenches of legal battles and advocacy, and she was ready to pass the torch to a new wave of passionate young lawyers. Together, Melissa and Rebecca founded a leadership institute to train and support emerging activists, organizers, and advocates. They knew that the struggle for justice was a marathon, not a sprint, and they wanted to ensure that the movement had the strength and resilience to go the distance. Chapter 30. A legacy of hope. Years passed, and the world continued to change. The housing justice movement faced new challenges, but it also saw new opportunities. Laws were passed, policies were changed, and awareness grew. The work was slow and often frustrating, but progress was being made. Melissa, now in her 60s, watched with pride as Maya became one of the movement's most prominent leaders. She had taken everything her mother had taught her and built upon it, leading with compassion, courage, and a fierce determination to make the world a better place. One day, as they sat together on the porch of Melissa's modest but cozy home, Maya turned to her mother and asked, "Do you ever wish you had done things differently?" Melissa smiled, her eyes filled with wisdom and love. "I've made my share of mistakes, and there were times when I was scared and unsure. But I don't regret a single moment of it, Maya. Because every step we took, every battle we fought, brought us to where we are today." Maya nodded, understanding the depth of her mother's words. She knew that the fight for justice would never be easy, but she also knew that it was worth every sacrifice. As they watched the sun set over the city they had both worked so hard to change, Melissa felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that her work was far from over, but she also knew that she had built something lasting, a movement, a legacy, a family, and as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, there would always be hope.